For decades, the world believed the Romanov family was dead. Official statements said the imperial family had been executed, case closed. But missing bodies and sealed records left room for doubt. Rumors of survival spread across Europe, women claiming to be Grand Duchess Anastasia. Stories of escape, secret rescues, hidden identities. For years, no proof existed to end the debate. Then in 1979, a geologist approached a grassy area in the Koptyaki forest near Yekaterinburg with a permit to dig. Authorities assumed he was there for geological research, but Dr. Alexander Avdonin had a different mission. He believed the bodies of the murdered Romanov family were somewhere in that field, and what he found would finally solve one of history's greatest mysteries. But the truth was worse than anyone imagined. When modern DNA science finally reopened the case, it did more than confirm what historians suspected. It exposed how the truth was hidden, how the evidence was suppressed, and what really happened to the Romanovs in Yekaterinburg. Avdonin and others who had long heard rumors about a grave began searching the area. They located a shallow burial site containing human bones and started an official excavation. When they dug deeper, they found a large number of skeletal remains which were given to scientists for DNA testing. In the past, several people claimed to be one of the children who miraculously survived, including a few who claimed to be Grand Duchess Anastasia. Were they telling the truth? Scientists were eager to solve the mystery, but it wasn't going to be easy. Investigators weren't sure how many people were buried in the mass grave. The bodies had been dumped together and decomposed over time, leaving behind disorganized bone fragments. There were no apparent signs or markers indicating whose remains they were. Yet scientists believed they might belong to the royal family and their close servants. But they still needed scientific proof, so the bones were carefully collected and labeled for further study. To confirm the identities, scientists needed techniques that could withstand the effects of time. Traditional ways of identifying remains were not precise enough. The bones were too damaged to make confident identifications based solely on physical characteristics. But modern DNA analysis offered a solution, enabling the extraction and analysis of DNA from old bones. This was the key to proving whether these bones belonged to members of the Romanov family. The first DNA test conducted between 1979 and 1990 confirmed that the bones indeed belonged to the Romanovs. Still, due to growing skepticism and a lack of trust in old DNA testing, scientists conducted new tests in 1993. And what they revealed left people shocked. The first step was to categorize the remains. Scientists used a type of test called short tandem repeat analysis, or STR. This method examined specific regions of DNA that vary between individuals. STR testing allowed researchers to determine how the skeletons were related to one another. The results showed that among the 9 sets of remains, 2 were adults, 1 male and 1 female, and 3 were female children. The patterns of relatedness suggested that a family was indeed present among the bones. The nuclear DNA results indicated that the adults were likely the children's parents, and that the children were related to each other. The other 4 skeletons were not closely related to this family group, which supported the idea that they might be servants or staff who were present with the Romanovs at the time. For the investigation to move forward, forensic genealogists had to step in. The second major type of DNA used was mitochondrial DNA. This form of DNA is inherited only from a person's mother and can be used to trace maternal ancestry far back through generations. Scientists collected mitochondrial DNA samples from the remains thought to be those of the Empress and her daughters. They then compared these samples with mitochondrial DNA from living relatives who shared the same maternal line. Forensic genealogists constructed a family tree to determine which relatives of the royal family were still living and whether they would be willing to provide a blood sample. For the Empress, the match was easy. She was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh and husband of Queen Elizabeth, was also a direct descendant, and he agreed to supply a DNA sample. The results were conclusive. The mitochondrial DNA from the remains matched that of Prince Philip. That meant the Empress and 3 of her daughters were indeed buried in the mass grave. Identifying the male adult was more complicated because mitochondrial DNA cannot be used to confirm a father's identity. Yet forensic investigators found a nephew of the Tsar living in Toronto, but he refused to cooperate. That meant genealogists had to dig deep into the Tsar's family tree and find living relatives who also had a maternal blood relationship with a shared female ancestor. Genealogists identified two distant relatives. One was the Tsar's great-niece, and the second was a duke in Scotland. Both agreed to provide DNA samples. In testing the mitochondrial DNA, researchers compared the base pairs between the Tsar, the Duke, and the great-niece. The Duke and the great-niece matched identically. The Tsar was identical to both, but with one exception. Investigators turned to the remains of the Tsar's brother George and extracted a DNA sample. He also had the same distinction, which confirmed the skeleton in the mass grave was indeed the last Tsar of Russia. The combined results from STR and mitochondrial DNA tests provided a clear picture. The bones in the mass grave belonged to a family group that matched the historical Romanov family. The individuals included the last Tsar, Nicholas II, his wife the Tsarina, and 3 of their daughters. The other 4 individuals were not part of the family, but were consistent with known servants and staff who were executed with the family. The scientists worked carefully to ensure the matches were accurate and not due to contamination or error. Unfortunately, it was not possible to identify the missing son, Alexei, and 1 daughter during this initial excavation, leaving a small mystery unresolved at the time. Nevertheless, the identification of the prominent family members using DNA was a scientific breakthrough that confirmed what many historians had long believed but could not prove. The results of these DNA tests were announced publicly in 1993 by British and Russian scientists who had worked together on the project. The findings were widely accepted by the scientific community and represented a major step forward in understanding the tragic end of the Romanovs. But 2 of the Romanov children were still missing, leaving part of the mystery unresolved. From 1993, historians and researchers studied old records, including notes from the chief executioner in 1918, who wrote about how the bodies were handled after the killings. These notes described how 9 bodies had been buried in one grave, yet while the bodies of Alexei and one of his sisters were burned and buried in a separate place. This information guided later searches. Archaeologists and amateur history groups began to look for this separate burial site near Yekaterinburg. Over the years, more than one search team tried to locate the remains. It was not until the summer of 2007 that a clear discovery was made. Around 70 meters from the larger mass grave, archaeologists found human remains that had been badly burned and damaged. Their location matched what was described in earlier historical notes. The remains found were scrutinized. They included parts of a young boy's skeleton and a young woman's skeleton. These bones, like the previous ones, were fragile and charred, making identification difficult. But scientists added another advanced DNA testing method that was far stronger than those available in the early 1990s. They used mitochondrial DNA, autosomal short tandem repeats, and YSTR testing, which examined genetic information passed down from father to son. By using all 3 methods together, scientists had a robust set of tools to identify bones more than 80 years old. The first step was to compare the DNA from the young boy's remains with that from the previously identified remains of Tsar Nicholas II and from known living relatives. Because Y-DNA is passed directly from father to son, it could be used to confirm that the boy was biologically related to Nicholas II. The results matched, proving that the boy was indeed Tsarevich Alexei. This confirmation put an end to decades of speculation about whether the heir to the Russian throne had survived. Testing also showed that the young woman was genetically related to the Romanov family through the maternal line. Her mitochondrial DNA closely matched that of her mother, Tsarina Alexandra, and living relatives. These results confirmed that the woman was one of the Tsar's daughters, either Maria or Anastasia. The genetic tests were so strong that scientists described the evidence as nearly irrefutable. The discovery of Alexei and one of his sisters was not just a minor addition to the story. It filled in the final missing pieces about where every member of the Romanov family was buried. It was only after scientists confirmed the identities of the newly found remains that they could say with confidence that all 7 members of the immediate family had died in 1918. The complete DNA record established that no members of the Romanov family had survived. The most famous claim came from a woman who called herself Anna Anderson. She surfaced in Berlin a few years after the execution and said she survived with the help of a kind Bolshevik soldier. Anderson's compelling story attracted attention and was even made into a 1956 movie. Until her death in 1984, Anderson contended she was the missing Tsarina. In the late 70s, however, Anderson had surgery on her lower bowel and the hospital kept a tissue sample. When the mass grave was discovered, the hospital gave researchers the tissue sample so they could determine whether Anderson was telling the truth. The mitochondrial DNA test proved Anderson was a fraud. She was not a Romanov. Instead, her DNA matched the Shanskowska family of Poland. Anderson's rival, Eugenia Smith, who also claimed she was Anastasia, refused to give a DNA sample before she died in 1997. The DNA evidence didn't just solve a historical mystery. It exposed decades of lies, fake identities, and suppressed truth. It proved that the Bolsheviks had murdered the entire family and buried them in unmarked graves. It showed that the rumors of survival were false, and it demonstrated the power of modern forensic science to uncover truth that had been hidden for nearly a century. The Romanov case remains one of the most important forensic investigations in history, not just because of who the victims were, but because of what the investigation revealed about the intersection of politics, science, and historical truth. What do you think? Should the DNA evidence have been accepted sooner? Were the controversies justified or just political theater? Drop your thoughts below. Hit like and subscribe, because history's greatest mysteries are being solved with science, and the truth is always more complex than we imagine.